In the story of Clair Obscur, every year that the number on the Paintress's monolith ticks down, an expedition is sent out, made up of brave warriors looking to discover the secrets of their fractured land. However, considering it took 67 years to actually accomplish this goal, there's just no possible way every one of the 42 expeditions sent out over that time were nearly as capable as the expeditioners we follow in the game's story. So I thought it would be fun to take every single expedition and rank them on a scale of S tier, them being the best of course, all the way down to F tier, reserved for the stinkiest failures in the bunch. And just to keep this video from becoming one red expedition log after the other, we're gonna go tier by tier and shake up the variety a little bit. So without further ado, let's start working our way up from F. This video is sponsored by GamerSupps, the ultimate energy and focus formula. Like most of you, I get tired right around 3 p.m. And after a long day's work, when I want to kick back and play some video games, I can just never find the energy. But to be honest, before they even approached me to be a sponsor, I used GamerSupps to fix that issue. GamerSupps is an awesome drink made up of a bunch of vitamins like vitamin C, vitamin D3, B6, B12, and vitamin H. All super good for you and your health. So it's not one of those awful sugar-filled concoctions that's gonna make you crash after drinking it. And it's got caffeine and things like nootropics to help you stay focused, stay energized, and in the game. Listen, I could never stand energy drinks myself, and coffee, to me personally, tastes like sewer water. But GamerSupps has so many awesome flavors and some really funny and cool designs. Personally, I've been drinking BBL GG lately, really good, tasty blueberry flavor, but I also enjoy some JFJ snake oil for that apple cider taste. Use the link in the description or pinned comment and use code NOOP for 10% off your next order of GamerSupps. If you're still skeptical about it, go check out the link and use my code anyway. They are more than willing to send you some free samples and give you a chance to try their product for free. Use my code NOOP now for 10% off, and thank you GamerSupps for sponsoring the channel. Our very first expedition in F tier has to be Expedition 81, which funnily enough is actually the very first log you'll come across in the game. As the third ever expedition after Expedition 0, this squad was one of the least knowledgeable and adapted to the threats on the continent of them all. These guys all met their fate getting distracted by the white jar Nevron that can be found in the same area. And when coming across this non-hostile Nevron that could actually speak, Expedition 81 was caught off guard by another Nevron, which resulted in them fighting to their deaths and accomplishing almost nothing on the continent. Rest in peace. Next is Expedition 78, and these bozos deserve to be on the bottom tier because not only did they steal all of Lumiere's airships, betraying the town's council and all, but for all that gusto and self-importance they had, their pilots ended up crash landing into the Stonewave Cliffs. The author of this journal insults Lumiere's government and says its people deserve strong leaders. I'm assuming he meant like him to lead them in these trying times. Someone that makes risky decisions like flying the airships into unknown territory without maybe first trying to map out where you're flying over. The confidence was appreciated. At least you can say for the next expedition, number 66, they were somewhat self-aware that they fucked up. These guys have one of the most memorable logs in the game because they can be found in Esquia's nest, and it tells the sad, embarrassing tale of the team that crumbled and fell apart due to mushroom poisoning. But it's not because they fought some mushroom Nevrons or anything like that. No, they legitimately ate Esquia's famous meal after hearing about or watching Verso consume it, and unfortunately for them, they were not aware that Verso is immortal. He dies angry and cursing Esquia for their deaths, which like completely goes untalked about. No one cares that Esquia just murked this entire expedition. Next in F tier is Expedition 63, and they're still kind of fresh, but the expeditions are now happening frequently at a yearly pace, so we can start feeling less and less bad for these guys as we continue on. Lumiere is becoming more developed and adapted to the continent by this point, and ironically enough, that advancement is exactly what bit 63 in the ass, because while they weren't as cocky or ignorant as the pilots of Expedition 78, they accomplished just as little, making it as far as the ancient sanctuary. All of their vehicles crashed into one of the giant rocks, all because of some damn road rage. But I would say that's still a better fate than Expedition 59, who all lost their lives due to being dumb enough to try cooking and eating a Nevron. Not only did they not make it very far across the continent, they followed this first mistake up by trying to cleanse their palates with some mushroom broth. So I can't tell what was worse. The fact that only one person in the expedition was smart enough to not eat the Nevron, or that all of Expedition 59 probably could have survived if they didn't follow in 66's footsteps. Another F-tier expedition has got to be the 54s. It's unknown if these guys really accomplished anything, as they are just found with their corpses littering the entire arena of the chromatic Hexca Nevron. Any and all record of their travels has been hijacked and taken over by some armchair philosopher who joined the expedition out of dissatisfaction with Lumiere's current political climate. We do get one interesting fact out of this, which is the expeditioners claim that by dissenting and acting out of the crowd, you can be forcefully enlisted into an expedition, implying that the government of Lumiere is ostracizing their political opponents as well as the radicals by sending them away to the fractured continent to die. These are some pretty severe accusations, but again, could be an unreliable narrator, as the author claims by joining the expedition, he really only planned to not abide by the political status and be his true self out in the open, planning on defecting from the expedition eventually to start his own society, a new Lumiere. And well, that clearly didn't happen. There's also not much to say about our next entry, Expedition 52, because while it's impressive they were able to get through the ancient sanctuary, it is an utter disappointment that their whole expedition came to an end because their warriors got their skulls fractured by gestural combat. Some friendly, quote-unquote, gestrals wanted to play fight, and now their brains are mush. Not much more to it than that. Expedition 44 frankly should have known better, which is why they're ranked down here, because by now they're all able to fully understand things like chroma and pictos, yet here we are making foolish mistakes like trying to disguise ourselves as Nevrons and seeing if we can just waltz our way through the monolith. I would have expected dressing themselves as Nevrons and getting killed in like the 60s, but not this far down the line. And I think that's why I'm judging them so harshly. But when it comes to the last expedition in F tier, you can really only feel bad for them because honestly, this was just one of the most tragic ways to go for any expedition. Expedition 40, Masters of the Air, and everything Expedition 78 wish they were able to travel across the entire continent with hang gliders, successfully skipping most of the dangerous Nevrons and actually reaching the monolith. Expedition 40 was a mere miles away from their goal when the first two members vanished into flower petals immediately, gommaging on impact with the barrier that surrounds the Paintress's monolith. Being left on a remote island now with absolutely no hope of escape, they can only basically await their demise because they're way too far to warn any other expedition about the barrier. Now entering C tier, category reserved for expeditions that honestly didn't do much either, but didn't end nearly as embarrassing as those who came before. Perfect example is Expedition 84, the first expedition launched in over 15 years since the failure of Expedition 0, doing their best to retrace the Zero Squad steps because literally no pieces of clothing or bodies were left behind, most likely because Clair just straight up gommaged them on the spot. Their expedition broke down not too far from the dark shores, right at the beginning of the continent. It is interesting to see how the Paintress still seems like a mythological creature at this point to people, the log admitting it all seems like superstitious hysteria to believe she's actually responsible for the fracture. The only reason these guys didn't end up in F tier is because at least they didn't get caught slacking while writing their journal like Expedition 81. That's also why I'm gonna give Expedition 65 a place in C tier. They did make it about as far as Minoko Station, even though they were so slow across the continent it costed them their whole entire year just to get this far. Despite leaving little behind and not even coming close to the Paintress, the remnants of Expedition 65 are able to find peace in knowing they'll be surrounded by the very accepting and hospitable Grandis, taking refuge in the frozen over station. However, some of the other expeditions were not as lucky to meet such a pleasant end. Some had their own communication systems and strategies used against them, like with Expedition 64, who didn't make it much further than the shores of the continent before they split their team up and got hunted down one by one. Their log explaining that despite checking in with one another every few days across radio transmitters, somehow their broadcast frequencies are being used against them and leading teams of expeditioners into traps, despite these radio codes never being used since the original Expedition Zero. They assume they've been betrayed, but we know it wasn't by any of their own people. One thing you'll also notice throughout these journals is the constant changes and technological advancements made by Lumerians over the time, as well as the constant regrets that not only do a lot of these inventions fail, it's kind of impossible for a lot of these expeditions to send knowledge of their failures back home, as Expedition 57 quickly found out about their siege vehicles, large boxed war machines that, sure, in Lumiere probably seemed like a big force to be reckoned with, but on the forgotten battlefield, surrounded by countless corpses and giant Nevrons, everything just seemed so small. The captain of Expedition 57 slowly finding herself realizing their journey is doomed, wondering if there really was a better way that Lumiere could allocate their resources for a more successful experiment, which honestly just shows how a lot of these expeditions were rigged from the very beginning. All of these grand plans just being absolutely futile. Expedition 43 meets a similar end to 57, dumping all of Lumiere's funds and manpower into creating high-powered submarines that, despite being well-intentioned, ended up being obliterated in one foul swoop by the Serpent Fair, the massive sea serpent Nevron that roams the oceans of the continent. Expedition 43 was left on a remote island stranded in the middle of nowhere, cursing the Paintress with their final breaths, when realistically, it's probably Clair who created that Nevron. Unfortunately, with most of the expeditions only able to work off of guesses as to why the previous ones failed, it's easy to see how one small mistake can just render an entire expedition neutralized. Unless those expeditions are able to leave warnings for future ones, it just creates self-fulfilling prophecies. We already had 2 expeditions meet their end to Esquia's mushrooms, and Expedition 33, our main protagonist, almost meet the same end as Expedition 45 did. As deeply hidden within a dungeon only known as the Crushing Cavern, our protagonists fall through a false caved-in trap floor, giving way to an underground cavern where a giant Nevron, whose only purpose is to crush everything that falls into its nest, waits patiently. Thankfully, we are able to fight off the Nevron and save our skins, but Expedition 45 was not as lucky, ending up completely flattened with just one survivor left who only got away with her bottom half being smashed. What's worse, her journal warning of the crushing trap is only retrievable from the other side of the cavern, meaning any expeditioners she would have hoped to have saved with that message would never see her signs until it was already too late, which is just terrible, but not the worst way for an expedition to fall apart. That probably goes to mutiny, and that's exactly what landed Expedition 48 into this tier, as despite making it all the way to the second major island of the continent, the expedition, as a team, fell apart from the inside out. Making it this far came at no small cost. They lost a lot of lives on the way, and according to the author of their expedition's log, it was all because of the terrible leadership of their captain. 2 expeditioners who believed themselves better off without their captain took it upon themselves to enact Expedition Code 23, a commandment that allows them to designate authority over their commanders. But since we're reading this from the mutineers' perspective, we'll probably never know if these 2 were actually justified in feeling this way. You've also got the traitor of Expedition 37, whose log can be found on the Gestrel Beach nearby the Sunless Cliffs, an area not too far off from the monolith itself, which means this expedition had to have gotten pretty far too. He abandons his entire expedition and assumedly leaves them for dead because he felt he deserved to enjoy what was left of his life, which it's like, why did you come along then? He hides away for his remaining days with the Gestrels at the Gestrel Beach, claiming that trying to complete the beach challenge might actually be harder than defeating the Paintress, which comes off as a pretty pretentious thing to say after leaving your entire expedition to die. But no one said expeditioners were always brave and confident warriors. Even if they were, that doesn't necessarily mean they were always right, or even really smart for that matter. As is shown in our next expedition, the 47th, otherwise known as the Drunken Brigade, a team of dedicated alcoholics that thought of their journey through the continent as nothing more than a game, living their lives to the fullest by drinking till they reached what Thomas the author called that perfect equilibrium. However, not everyone is a trained and professional alcoholic, as Thomas even mentions the younger expeditioners have trouble keeping up with the elders, but they force them into overconsumption anyway, which is most most likely why their expedition didn't make it too far past Monaco Station, which, considering everyone in F tier was sober, is pretty commendable. Our next entries are going to be Expedition 38 and 36, who frankly we just don't know enough about to judge in any justifiable way. I can place all the previous expeditions in F tier because of their outright horrendous endings, but the locations that 38 and 36's logs are found in, it's safe to say that they both made it decently far, and just for one reason or another, might have missed their parry timings or something. Expedition 38 tells the tale of Genevieve and Pierre Oscar, who, realizing they had little time left until the gommage, just decided to spend their final days by each other's side. Meanwhile, 36 gives us nothing to go off of and just consists of a poem written by one of the last surviving members of the team, mostly symbolizing what this expeditioner saw and felt in their final moments of life at the White Tree location. It does show how the human mind is able to find purpose and even beauty in the worst of situations. A similar sentiment that can be found in our final expeditions in C tier, 42 and 51. Two expeditions that also made it very far, 51 reaching the Frozen Hearts, and 42 almost coming out the other side of Old Lumiere, both prove that the bonds formed amongst humans living out their last year might have been the only piece of comfort they had in the end. Expedition 51 details their family-like bond that the expeditioners felt between each other, claiming the only people that can truly understand them are others who are out here in the continent risking their lives. The luxury of being able to share your final moments with people who have struggled just as you did is a feeling of satisfaction that was more than enough to let the expeditioners pass on without regret. The same can be found in 42's journal, where the author Armande, instead of lamenting about her expedition's failures, sees the bright side that even though they failed, the amount of knowledge and experience they gained will be of use to every future expedition that comes after. Expedition 51 displays the camaraderie between an expedition team, while 41 shows that that camaraderie extends to every future expedition as well. A pretty fitting end to C tier. On to B tier, these expeditions, although not being standout selections either, we can at least give these squads an accolade of accomplishing something while being out on the continent. Whether this be because they were competent enough to reach an Axon island before meeting their end, such as expeditions 61, 58, 55, 39, and 34 were able to do. Expedition 55 making it all the way to Serene and meeting their end due to, honestly, a very terrible counter matchup that the expedition could have never seen coming, as up until this point, the 55s were able to get through the continent by augmenting their pictos with music. But when reaching Serene's island, they would find their musical pictos had no effect at all. She Who Plays with Wonders ballet resonated across the island and locked all of her minions in a trance that the music pictos could not break through, bringing Expedition 55 to a complete halt. Expedition 39 is even more uneventful, having no interesting or unique aspects to their expedition and really only being able to reach B rank because they made it to Visage's island. Because after they reached the Axon's home and split up to do recon, Expedition 39 most likely met its end while remaining absolutely terrified of the emotionally charged Nevrons in the area. You've also got Expedition 61, who despite making it to the Reacher, really don't have much to say for themselves other than the woman Margot who authored their expedition's log, pondering the existence of the Axon, She Who Reaches for the Stars. She found herself amazed by the weird society that was built around the Axon and how they are endlessly trying to tear the Reacher down. Even though she understands the Axon was a dangerous creature, the situation makes Margot feel bad for the Reacher, as besides the green inventor Nevron at the top of her tower, the Axon is the odd one out, a feeling that almost makes Margot want to help the Axon reach the stars herself. I'm also going to include Expedition 58 in this group because, technically speaking, they made it to Old Lumiere and witnessed the corpse of She Who Hauls the Weight of the World directly in their log, and they worked with Verso, so I'm going to go ahead and give them a pass on B tier. They were one of the first teams to work exclusively with him and were also affiliated with the Curator and knew enough that he could manufacture weapons with the Axon Hearts. It's unclear exactly how they met their end in Old Lumiere, but I think those two facts are enough to rank them higher than most other expeditions. Speaking of technical technicalities, I'm also going to go ahead and lump in Expedition 34 in the Axon Island group as well, even though technically their final stand was held with the Chromatic Nevron at the Crows. But that location is literally a hop, skip, and a jump away from the Reacher's dungeon. You can see the Axon's Island in the background of the dungeon, so that's close enough for me to include the 34s in B tier. They focused all of their pictos around elements, a strategy that got them pretty far. The author Corinne even mentions they discovered much about chroma, and ultimately their true failure was being unable to tap into the monolith's source of energy. We even get a nice little Easter egg of Expedition 33 and Gustav's idea of converting pictos into lumina, a cute nod to our king and the lumina converter. And speaking of badass, that's just honestly the main reason a lot of these expeditions made it to B rank, because if it wasn't for their Giga Chad energy, they certainly would not have accomplished more than the C tiers. And I'm talking specifically about Expedition 62 and 41, who both turned their journeys across the continent into bloodbaths and a game where Nevron kills were points on a scoreboard. Both the 62s and 41s were nothing but bloodthirsty warriors that wished to waste the last year of their lives on the battlefield, acknowledging that while their lives are short, the 62s prove that things like competition or finding fun in the macabre are all these people have, keeping them going in a world already forsaken. And sure, I mean, if they're gonna die, to quote Emily of Wolf 41, they might as well die big. Last but not least, the final three expeditions in B tier are the expeditions that, against all odds, fought to the bitter end for the mission. They may not have made it very far, but the level of strength and human resilience found on 68, 50, and 49 are not only proof of human excellence, but show that not all expeditions are created equal. Expedition 68 didn't really make it further than the Flying Waters. However, that's most likely because while they were on their way, a massive storm blew over their ship and trapped them in a terrifying hurricane that almost costed them everything. Through their struggle, they were able to weather the storm and reach the continent, even mentioning that once they finally disembarked, taking down the Nevrons was little more than an afterthought. That being said, their luck did not last very long at all and were most likely slaughtered by a stronger Nevron that laid in wait. Expedition 49 also did meet a tragic end in the Falling Leaves dungeon in a final stand against the Scavenger Nevron that can be fought after completing the Fading Boys quest. Despite all of their manpower, they were locked into an endless struggle with the Scavenger and turned it into a battle of attrition that they had no hope of winning. And no matter how many times the expeditioners could heal themselves and get back up, one thing they could not replenish were resources like food or water, meaning sadly it was not the Scavenger that took Expedition 49 down, but starvation, dehydration, and time. I'm also giving Expedition 50 B tier, the legendary expedition that transformed a goddamn Ferris wheel into a vehicle and used it to traverse the continent, something that even the citizens of Lumiere view as some mythological tale of heroism. And sure, there are other expeditions that put all their effort into some obscure vehicle and got capsized as well, but I'm gonna give Expedition 50 extra points for just thinking outside of the box with this whole Ferris wheel thing. And we're finally here in the A tiers, containing only the best expeditions that were actually able to accomplish something in their year-long journey over the continent. These teams of expeditioners are either the sole reason our own party is able to achieve our own success, such as in the case of Expedition 67, who not only made it all the way to Serene, but were responsible for clearing the path through the Axon's fortress with explosives, creating an exact route that Expedition 33 is able to use to reach her during the main game's journey. Or you've got the expedition that was responsible for one of the key discoveries that shapes the way every expeditioner traveled the continent on every future trip, such as Expedition 53, who despite barely making it past the first half of the continent, were the first team to experiment with the plants and fauna on the continent, eventually creating the first ever concoction of healing/revive tinctures, the most essential item in keeping your party members alive and healthy amongst the constant Nevron threat. And speaking of expeditions that made other ones possible, there isn't a better expedition that fits the description of an A tier than the one that started it all, Expedition 0. I think one of the biggest misconceptions about Expedition 0 is that they were some legendary mythical group of expeditioners that laid the path for all who came after. Realistically, despite managing to make it all the way to the barrier on their first try, their actual goal of search and rescue was a pretty humongous failure. The only survivors of Expedition 0 that came back were Painted Renoir and Verso. Sure, they were able to return to Lumiere with the first knowledge of Nevrons, Gestrels, so on and so forth, but it created a massive split in the government of Lumiere and resulted in Painted Renoir and Verso's eventual self-exiles after discovering the truth of their existences. All of Expedition Zero was slaughtered by Clair, and any remaining members of the search and rescue team took Verso hostage, believing him to have betrayed them for the Paintress when he came back alive, leaving Verso no choice but to take their lives to save himself, believing that if he helped his mother, he can just have Aline repaint all the people that died. And of course, we know Verso eventually abandons this dream and instead hopes to eject the Paintress from the canvas. While it was a crucial expedition that gave us a lot of the basic foundations of knowledge we have going forward, as for accomplishing an actual goal, it was a terrible mistake. And if anything, kind of created way more problems than the world had even prior to its expedition. And that gives me two more expeditions before we get to the S tier. First is Expedition 56, a team that, while only making it about as far as the Stone Wave Cliffs, was able to achieve something that no other expedition ever could, and that is capturing one of Aline's painted family, most likely Painted Alicia based off the log's contents. But after watching the woman who mentored her, Simone, be ruthlessly slaughtered by the white-haired family, the author of Expedition 56's log, Lizette, made it her life's mission to get revenge. But what's actually surprising about this is she actually succeeded in trapping Painted Alicia. Aline's painted family literally has the control to stop all of the time in the canvas. Obviously, Renoir was getting his daughter back. And then there's Expedition 46, the expedition that was led by Lune's parents, and the team that met their end battling to the death against the chromatic glissando on Serene's island. Bridget, Lune's mother, despite being heavily poisoned by the glissando, fought off the chromatic Nevron by her lonesome, holding the creature back and protecting her entire expedition. Even though she did eventually succumb to her infection, the author of Expedition 46's journal mentions that Lune's mother was able to pass peacefully, believing that whatever work she could not finish herself, her daughter Lune would be able to pick back up when she made her own expedition. And this is it, the best of the best, the S-tiered expeditions, those that were quite literally irreplaceable, the teams that no one can deny or argue against. Out of all 42 expeditions, there's only 4 that deserve this level of praise. And of course, those first 2 selections have to be Expeditions 70 and 69. The 2 teams responsible for constructing both the grapple points and climbing handholds across the entire continent. These teams of people carried out their missions flawlessly. And not only that, were fully aware their sacrifices would only benefit those who came after. These brave expeditioners weathered every location on the continent, survived all odds, and even managed to lay down infrastructure inside the monolith itself, fully exhibiting the motto that every expedition claimed to uphold. These 2 expeditions were given a less than glamorous job that ended in a thankless death. But without them, well, there quite literally would not be a tomorrow that comes. And speaking of sacrifice, that is exactly why I'm ranking an expedition like Expedition 35 alongside these greats, laying the path for those who come after, which is quite literally what 35 did. The members of Expedition 35 are found chain-linked together, their corpses molded like some kind of clay structure, building a bridge to reach the other side of a mountain's cliff, leading towards the chromatic Nevron that most likely dealt the finishing blow to all of these brave expeditioners. Instead of giving up and letting death take them, they spit in the face of their mortality and climbed over one another to create this bridge of flesh for every expedition that might come after. Funnily enough, this bridge does ultimately seem kind of pointless at the end of the day. Game-wise, it only leads to a dead end with an optional chromatic enemy. However, the imagery of a bridge made from the fallen expeditioners is not an easily forgotten sight. Last but not least, the only expedition expedition in history that I believe holds a candle to our main cast in number 33. The expedition most of you probably already expected to be ranked at the top, the legendary Expedition 60. If you aren't familiar with Expedition 60, I quite honestly feel bad for you, because they are one of the best memes to come out of Clair Obscur, yet despite being a meme, their tenacity as an expedition is one of a kind, and I don't think there's a single expedition that comes close. Expedition 60 consisted of a group of expeditioners that deemed things like Pictos, Chroma, and all things supernatural as unnecessary to reach the peak of existence, dedicating their lives to training their physical bodies and foregoing clothes in order to achieve maximum acrobatic and aerodynamic prowess. Despite being a group of 59-year-old men and women, these expeditioners were the pinnacle of strength. So much so that even without the curator's help or defeating an Axon, Expedition 60 was able to break through the monolith's barrier with their muscles, completely unharmed, reaching the Paintress and uncovering the truth of their canvas world, and how Renoir, he who's trapped below the monolith, is the actual bringer of the Gommage. Getting further than literally any other expedition in history, the team making their way down to Renoir's drafts to confront who they saw as the real villain, while a single reconnaissance member was sent back to warn Lumiere and expose the lies of their world. Unfortunately, that final member of Expedition 60 would never reach Lumiere. Swimming all the way from the monolith back to the mainland, he was a mere mile or so from the coast before his Gommage time had ended, using the final ounces of his strength to leave a final warning in his last log. Is that not the most ridiculous fucking thing you've heard all day? If that is not a PSA that we should all be exercising daily, I don't know what is. And that's every expedition in Clair Obscur ranked and explained to the best of my ability. Obviously, I did not include our main expedition. It should be obvious they're at the top of the food chain. I figured it would just make way more sense to spend all of our time on the other groups. I would love to hear what some of your guys' favorite expeditions were. Thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe if you want to keep seeing content like this. YouTube really enjoys that for the algorithm. Hit the like button, and I'll see you guys in the next video.